A tournament named Megalobox has just been created. This tournament is a combination of sports, boxing, and modern technology. It is organized by a large corporation and promises to surpass all nations and organizations. It allows anyone to rise with the desire to win the title of the strongest fighter. The scale will be worldwide. The match will take place in 3 months to find the true champion. The media claims that this tournament is just a violent TV show. However, the large corporation sees it as a community program. At the same time, we learn that the fighters participating in the tournament will be equipped with a support device called gear. Our main character, Joe, is currently watching information about the Megalobox tournament. While repairing his motorcycle, the repair shop owner does not know what he did to cause such extensive damage to the bike. Simultaneously, he also advised Joe to register for that boxing tournament. But even if Joe wants to, he cannot participate because he is not a legal citizen of this country. People living outside the city like Joe are called free citizens. Therefore, they are not controlled by any government but also do not have the rights of a citizen, being both at the top and at the bottom of society. Joe's current job is to be a boxer in an underground arena for the gangsters' betting games. Discouraged from following in any form, Joe had just arrived at his workplace when his drunken coach named Nanbu came to borrow some money because he had just lost a bet. Joe often has to fight in matches that were pre-arranged by the organizers to scam the betting money from the viewers. At this point, Joe felt extremely disheartened because he always had to pretend to lose in the ring, despite his high talent. However, as an illegal citizen like Joe, he had no choice but to endure and accept because this was the only job he could do to make money. Before going up to the ring, Joe was given a pair of headphones to follow Nanbu's instructions. He was also equipped with a gear set to assist in fighting, similar to the Megalobox tournament. But the audience and Joe's opponent were very surprised because his gear was so shabby. As soon as they entered the arena and heard the start signal, Joe's opponent attacked him aggressively with his modern gear. Everyone could see that he had the advantage in equipment, but Joe gently brushed his opponent's arm aside and began to counterattack. The thing is, Joe hadn't managed to knock his opponent out when the whistle signaling the end of the round suddenly blew. After witnessing Joe's performance, many people chose to trust and bet on him. Joe let Nanbu know that if he fought seriously, the opponent would surely be knocked out with just one punch. But in the second round, Joe had to pretend to lose so that the organizers could win all the betting money from those who had bet on him. What's the lesson here? The house always wins, so give up those red and black games and be a person. After the recent deal, Nanbu also made some money to pay off debts, but Joe no longer found interest in this unethical job, so he took his newly repaired motorcycle for a spin. Meanwhile, the female president of that corporation, Yuki, was monitoring the construction of the stadium for the Megalobox tournament. And accompanying Yuki was a silver-haired fighter under her command named Yuri. Right after that, as Yuki was crossing the street, she was almost hit by Joe driving by, but he managed to swerve to avoid her and crashed straight into the sidewalk. Thanks to that, Yuki was unharmed. As Yuki approached to apologize, Joe scolded her for crossing the street without looking. Yuki handed Joe her business card and said, "Call me if you need compensation." But when Joe realized she was the person organizing the Megalobox tournament, he didn't need it and tossed the business card away. As Yuki was about to leave, Joe suddenly said that her tournament was just trash, so Yuri quickly stepped up and demanded a match with Joe to defend his boss. Before the two of them had a chance to confront each other, Yuki told Yuri to return with her the next morning. Then, they continued to return to the underground ring to fight in arranged matches as usual. Joe and Nanbu waited for a long time, but their opponent did not show up. However, Yuri unexpectedly stepped onto the ring with a set of modern gear integrated into his body. Upon seeing Yuri, everyone was astonished because he is the champion of the Megalobox tournament. Yuri revealed that he came to settle a dispute from the previous night with Joe. Nanbu tried to stop the match, believing Joe could not defeat Yuri. However, Joe, angered, punched Nanbu and happily accepted Yuri's challenge. Everyone was excited and eagerly bought tickets to bet on Yuri in this match. As soon as the match began, Joe rushed to attack Yuri but could not land a hit. Even a light punch from Yuri caused a slight scratch on Joe's face. After that, Yuri declared that he would defeat Joe with just one hand. Indeed, he gave Joe a severe beating using only his left hand. Seeing Joe knocked down by Yuri, Nanbu advised Joe to stay down if he didn't want to get more hurt. But Joe stubbornly stood up and continued the unfinished match. This time, Joe succeeded. He dodged Yuri's left-handed attack and landed a punch on Yuri's face, forcing him to block with his right hand. Only then did Yuri truly acknowledge Joe's ability. He decided to fight with both hands to show Joe what a real Megalobox fighter is like. Immediately after, Joe attacked Yuri but was struck down by a powerful punch, as if struck by lightning. Yuri's punch made Joe collapse on the floor, gradually losing consciousness. The referee declared Yuri the winner when he saw that Joe was completely knocked out and unable to stand up. However, as Yuri was about to leave the underground ring, Joe suddenly stood up and demanded to continue the fight. Yuri refused, not wanting to fight a weakling like Joe. Yuri stated that if Joe wanted to continue, he would have to join the Megalobox tournament and meet him in the finals. After being humiliatingly defeated by Yuri, Joe decided to take his motorcycle for a ride. He resolved to join the tournament to have a rematch with Yuri. At the same time, Yuki also discovered that Yuri had gone to the underground ring to fight Joe. She reminded Yuri that he was not allowed to go to the underground ring anymore as he did just now. As soon as Joe returned to the underground ring, he asked Nanboy to find a way to help him enter the tournament. However, Nanbu thought it was impossible because Joe was not a legal citizen there, not to mention that only the 4 strongest fighters were allowed to participate in the Megalobox tournament. Nanbu advised Joe to give up that fanciful thought and prepare for his upcoming match. According to the organizer's arrangement, Joe was supposed to lose in the 5th round today. But Joe decided not to listen to Nanbu and knocked out his opponent with just one punch. Right after that, Nanbu was taken to meet the boss of this ring, Fujio, to apologize for not following the arrangement. He was forced to work for Fujio until he paid off the debt he owed him. That day, Nanbu was extremely afraid. He had to bow and apologize until he was injured, but Fujio still wanted to take his remaining eye as punishment. With no other choice, Nanbu suddenly said that he would find a way to get Joe into the Megalobox tournament. After Joe won the tournament, he would pay off all his debt to Fujio without missing a cent. Fujio also felt a bit interested when he saw Nanbu's determination, so he ordered someone to make a fake citizen ID for Joe so that he could participate in the tournament. After receiving Joe's fake citizen ID, Nanbu went to register him to compete in the Megalobox. Due is currently ranked the lowest because this is his first time participating in an official tournament. Joe will live temporarily on a boat with Nanbu until the tournament takes place. Joe understands that he must reach the finals to have a chance to face Yuri. But Nanbu said boastfully not to pay attention to Yuri but to focus on defeating the opponents in front of him to climb the ranks. Yuri's gear is the most advanced type produced by the corporation, and it has been implanted directly into Yuri's body as a part of him. Meanwhile, a group of homeless kids plan to steal goods from the market. While the camera store owner was not paying attention, they stole several cameras from him. Joe, along with Nanbu, went to a store to buy spare parts for Joe's current gear. However, Nanbu suddenly became overjoyed upon seeing a gear made from titanium alloy. The security guard informed them that this gear was the first prototype produced by the technology corporation. Shortly after, the group of children from earlier arrived at the store to sell some cameras they had just stolen. The store owner paid them with a few pieces of candy as a form of payment. A boy named Sachio became very angry because the owner gave them one less candy than promised. When Sachio objected, the owner pulled out a small knife to threaten the boy, forcing Joe to quickly intervene and stop the store owner. Before things got worse, the children quickly left the place. Joe, however, was slashed by the owner, leaving a cut on his nose. Joe and Nanbu returned to their boat under the bridge. Nanbu had to train Joe vigorously because his first opponent was quite strong. While playing by the river with his friends, Sachio discovered that Joe was planning to participate in a tournament. Sachio asked Joe to take him to the tournament, but Joe did not want to bring a kid like Sachio along. The boy left angrily. The next morning, Sachio's friends arrived even though Joe knew that the boy had been locked up by the spare parts store owner for trying to steal the titanium alloy gear. The boy said his friends tried to give the gear to Joe to wear for the competition. Meanwhile, the store owner was having his security guard torture Sachio to force him to return the gear. Suddenly, Joe rode his motorcycle into the store and knocked down the security guard with his bike. However, the guard was unharmed after the collision. Just as Nanbu and the kids arrived, Joe successfully rescued Sachio. Right after that, Due took off his coat, revealing the titanium gear inside. But after just one hit from the security guard, the gear shattered into many pieces. Nevertheless, Joe decided he would defeat the guard barehanded. He ran straight at the guard and knocked him out, to everyone's surprise. Joe saw Sachio in a new light after this incident and decided to take him to the tournament to assist him. A few days later, Joe went to the Megalobox tournament arena to participate in the first qualifying round. His opponent was a strong-looking fighter ranked 185th, but Joe fought him without using any gear or support tools. It turned out that the night before the competition, Nanbu had suggested that Joe fight without gear. If he fought barehanded, strong opponents and the media would pay more attention to Joe. And if he follows this plan, he will be promoted faster to soon make it to the finals of the tournament. Returning to the present, everyone is quite surprised because Joe did not use any gear to compete. Joe's opponent thinks he is underestimating him and the entire tournament. However, the referee believes that there are no rules or regulations requiring competitors to have gear or assistive devices. As soon as the match starts, the other guy keeps attacking Joe, forcing him to focus on dodging. He counterattacks and continuously strikes the opponent's face, but the lack of gear makes his punches less powerful. In contrast, the other guy, though formidable, is quite slow in delivering punches. However, if he lands a hit, Joe will surely receive a lot of damage. He had just hit Joe once, and Joe immediately fell, even though he had blocked it. Joe then got up by the count of 5. Nanbu had to call him back for a discussion. Nanbu wants him to make fewer mistakes like before if he doesn't want to end at the qualifying round. He advises him not to be reckless but to move more to make the opponent lose balance. Both he and Sachio outside the ring are anxious and messing things up. When the match resumes, Joe feels his steps are very heavy. Joe keeps dodging, causing the audience to become upset. The opponent is quite frustrated, unable to hit Joe. So, when he finally catches Joe, he angrily throws him to the ground and beats him up. But he is warned by the referee because his action of throwing is against the rules. Back to the match, Joe still tries to dodge while Nanbu outside keeps complaining and shouting at him. During the break, Nanbu and Joe have an argument. He complains about Dewey's ungentlemanly fighting, while Joe still wants to fight his own way. Sachio spoke up, claiming that Nanbu only cared about fame and profit like those watching the tournament. Now, he is no different from a skilled coach. Nanbu reflected and realized that Joe was afraid to fight without gear. So, he told Joe to find a way to conquer his fear. After hearing Nanbu's advice, Joe finally regained his composure. Then, although Joe remembered what he had learned from Nanbu and moved more fluidly, his opponent tried to attack him but couldn't land a hit. He even managed to easily throw a powerful punch that knocked his opponent down to the floor. When the opponent was completely knocked out, the referee declared Joe the winner. The surrounding audience was amazed and stood up to congratulate Joe. That afternoon, they happily went home after Joe's first victory in the Megalo box. Afterward, Joe continued to defeat many other opponents to increase his rank and reputation. He quickly became famous for not using gear. However, with his current position, Joe was still not able to make it to the finals of the tournament. So, Nanbu asked a reporter to arrange for Joe to fight a high-ranking boxer. Nanbu was shocked to learn that the boxer Joe was about to fight was his former student. Later, it was revealed that this man was Aragaki. Nanbu never expected to meet Aragaki there, and he was also happy to have escaped the hell-called war. Aragaki was very grateful to Nanbu for helping him return to boxing in this tournament. He wanted to express his gratitude to Nanbu, but for Nanbu, seeing him alive and well was enough. Nanbu was surprised that Aragaki was now in the top 17 and still chose to fight Joe, a newcomer. But that was the only favor he would give to Nanbu because he decided to destroy Joe, the fighter Nanbu had spent so much time on, as he also wanted to reclaim what he had lost from Nanbu. Nanbu then returned and told Joe that he would not fight the next match. Joe, angrily asking what that meant, was told by Nanbu that not fighting meant not fighting. Joe believes that fighting Aragaki in the higher rank will help him advance more easily. This is what they have been aiming for from the start. However, he thinks the outcome will only be very bad. He does not say that Joe will definitely lose. He only implies that Joe's upcoming match will be extremely difficult and that his current strength is not enough. Joe's opponent knows all of his strategies. He is also the best talent he has ever trained. But Sachio has shown him that Aragaki is no longer as he used to be. After being brought back from the battlefield, he lost his legs. He now has to use prosthetic legs to walk. He did not expect Aragaki to be able to fight in this condition. But he also does not want Joe to be complacent because Aragaki is still very strong. However, Joe is determined to defeat Aragaki, so he has decided to follow Joe's decision. Both of them then went to train. Nanbu knows Joe's weakness is that his arm strength is very weak. If he cannot get close enough, Joe will not be able to exert enough force to harm his opponent. He knows that now none of his unusual tactics can be applied. So the only way is to hone Joe's existing skills. The next day, Joe went out for a run. When he returned, he asked Sachio where Nanbu was. He had gone out and was mumbling something. While cooking, he advised Sachio to also exercise more instead of playing with machines too much. But the enthusiastic boy, Sachio, found more information about Aragaki. He learned that Aragaki was very talented and strong. However, due to his age, he had been called to serve in the military. When he returned, he was in a devastated state. Nevertheless, after returning to competition, it only took him a few months to climb back up to his current rank of 17. Most of his opponents were so brutally battered that it seems his statement about destroying Joe was not a joke. At this time, Nanbu went to look for Aragaki but only met his new coach. The coach led Nanboy to see the graves of soldiers who returned from the war. These individuals could not withstand the psychological shock from the battlefield. After some time back home, they all chose to end their lives. Aragaki overcome these challenges and chose to return because he wanted to meet Nanbu again. Yet, Nanbu was not there. Nanbu thought Aragaki had died, so the other coach believed Nanbu had given up too soon because of a death notice. Nanbu knew he was wrong and did not ask Aragaki for forgiveness. However, he hoped Aragaki would not bring personal issues into the ring. He later met with Aragaki and advised him. He suggested that Aragaki should give up this match and aim for higher-ranked opponents. Because fighting a lower-ranked person is meaningless, and if Aragaki remains stubborn, he will look no different than a pathetic loser. Angry at being abandoned, he envied Nanbu's new student, who had taken the position that should have been his. But he believed he had his own circumstances that Nanbu could not understand. Aragaki had once intended to seek out Nanbu. But it was Nanbu who helped him abandon that thought. Aragaki went to Nanbu's gym to find him, but it was closed and now dissolved. At that moment, he met Joe Nanbu, who had just returned. He heard that Joe had gone somewhere else. Sachio found information that Aragaki's gear was not too heavy, so the power increase would not be too much. But Nanbu knew that he chose light gear to not affect his speed. He bet that the new legs might even be faster than the old ones. Nanbu had just learned that Aragaki was still alive. In recent days, he has almost forgotten everything about Aragaki, so it's no wonder he is disliked. He can't blame anyone for that. As for Aragaki, even though Joe knows that the old Nanbu would never boast by letting his student fight without gear, Joe still trusts Nanbu. However, Aragaki believes that sooner or later, he will be abandoned by Nanbu. He knows that Aragaki is angry and blames Nanbu for his current state. He likes to blame anyone at will, but ultimately, the decision will still be his own. So if he intends to destroy him, he is welcome to try, but he should know it won't be easy. During training, Nanbu always wanted Joe to learn how to counter Aragaki. But he believes he will not lose, so Nanbu need not worry because he will fight in his own way. After all this time, Aragaki still can't forget the day he lost his legs. Yet, the image of Nanbu is what causes him the most heartache. The match is about to start. The number of spectators has swelled, and the arena can hardly contain them all. Meanwhile, Nanbu has come to find Aragaki to admit his faults and wants him not to take out his anger on Joe. When they entered the arena, everyone cheered for both Aragaki and Joe. Nanbu remembered the day he heard Aragaki had died. He was very angry and lost his composure. The coach from the other side now only believes that Aragaki must fight this match to lift his spirits, so he let him start the fight. Joe and Aragaki exchanged a few light blows. Joe was knocked down but quickly got up again. Just as Joe missed a punch, Aragaki swiftly knocked Joe to the floor. Aragaki seems very serious about wanting to crush Nanbu's hopes. Seeing Joe knocked down 5 times without getting up, Nanbu started to worry, while Aragaki was determined to reclaim everything from Nanbu. Joe then stood up and continued to challenge Aragaki. Joe then kept grappling with Aragaki, but the audience began to get bored and wanted them to fight properly. Sachio thinks that Nanbu must know some weakness of Aragaki. But he realizes that Aragaki is now different from before. He uses his prosthetic legs so well to strike and counterattack whenever there's an opening. Joe was then thrown out and Aragaki maintained such a good distance that he couldn't counterattack. Just as Aragaki caught a break, he launched an attack, but fortunately, the bell rang. The round saved Joe. Nanbu wanted Joe to give up here because he couldn't win. Ensuring his student's safety out of the ring is also a coach's duty. He could find another match for Joe to fight, without necessarily having to be stubborn about it here and risk an injury that could prevent him from fighting later. But Joe believed that the path he was on was a one-way street. If Nanbu couldn't follow and wanted to turn back, he should get off, otherwise, he should just stay silent and watch. At this point, Joe returned to the ring and decided to distribute his strength evenly between both hands. When Aragaki heard Nanbu's teachings from Joe's mouth, he lost his composure, charged forward, and knocked Joe down. However, Joe continued to stand up and still tried to apply Nanbu's training. Thanks to a defensive strategy to close in on Aragaki, Joe made it through the second round. Aragaki's coach wanted him to finish the fight in the next round. Aragaki remembered the words Joe had just said, which were also the ones Nanbu had taught him to cover his own weaknesses. Meanwhile, Nanbu informed Joe that Aragaki was gradually catching on to his tactics. At this moment, Aragaki just wanted to torment Joe right in front of him. Joe admitted that Nanbu was right, but that was just the beginning. Now, Aragaki realized that winning wasn't as easy as he thought, so both were aiming for victory, and Joe couldn't easily retreat. Back in the match, Joe continued to provoke Aragaki, making Aragaki more dominant in his attacks on Joe. Nanbu didn't understand what Aragaki's ultimate goal was now. He knew he had made a mistake by pushing Joe into this fight and also by not trusting Joe. Now, Joe was paying off a debt to Aragaki for him. Joe was knocked down once again. But he stood up, believing that Nanbu was wrong. He didn't care about what happened between them, he just saw Aragaki as an obstacle that he had to overcome. Then, Joe kept repeating Nanbu's words, which began to unsettle Aragaki. Aragaki swung and missed, not taking advantage of the opening. Joe then delivered a knockout blow that made Aragaki collapse on the spot. After the coach called out, Aragaki finally came to his senses. Both returned to a defensive stance as in the second round, waiting for the opponent to make a mistake. Thanks to the recent move, Nanbu became more determined that Joe would surely win on both sides. Now, they both fight by distributing their strength evenly between both hands. Nanbu told Sachio that the reason Joe has always been able to survive in the underground arena with just that shabby gear is because he has a strong will and is not easily broken. Aragaki increasingly exposed his weaknesses and got hit by Joe. He soon lost his balance and kept getting hit, but Aragaki was forced to struggle to strike back. And once again, the whistle signaling the end of the round sounded. Joe and Aragaki could smile at each other. Afterward, Aragaki spoke to the coach and then chose to give up, conceding the victory to Joe. Joe knew that even though he won, he was also exhausted and collapsed. The reason Aragaki gave up was that his prosthetic leg had started to become unstable. If he continued, he might not be able to walk anymore. Nanbu then went to meet his former student. He also realized that Araki was injured in the leg. He had tried to close everything with him by defeating Joe. He had been looking for an answer, and now he had the answer he wanted. Joe told him rightly that his current plight was due to his own decisions, and he had no right to resent anyone. He then asked Nanbu to return something to him. It was the betting ticket Nanbu had from before. Nanbu had intended to bet on a game to earn money to treat Aragaki to a meal before he enlisted, but since he lost, he gave it back to Aragaki as a lucky charm. Indeed, it had saved his life by helping him abandon his intention to find himself. Aragaki then asked him to convey his best wishes to Joe. Not long after, the third person to win a ticket to the main Megalobox tournament was revealed. He is 2 meters tall and has an extremely aggressive fighting style. The press asked Yuki if there was any chance for Joe, to which she replied she would only answer if his ranking continued to rise. Yuri then learned about Joe's rapid rise in the rankings outside, indicating that their feud was not yet over. However, Yuri's colleague believed that Joe would soon fall because this tournament was not meant for strays. Since the previous match, Joe's fame has skyrocketed, with everyone rushing to publish articles about him. Street art about Joe also became widespread. Joe's fans are considered the top of all fan types, commanding respect wherever they go. Wearing clothes with a goat print is like a king wearing his royal robe. Soon after, the match between the top 4 and top 7 took place. We only need to pay attention to the young man in the top 7, Mikio. Everyone wondered if Joe had a chance to enter this match, but Nanbu did not want to be petty, so he went to watch without letting Joe fight. He accidentally met Yuki and suggested that if she did not give Joe a chance to fight, many would think she was favoring her brother, Mikio. Of course, she would give Joe a chance to shine if he was not injured after the match with Aragaki. Indeed, Joe was injured and chained at home by Nanboy to prevent him from sneaking out to train haphazardly. The match between the top 4 and Mikio was indescribable, except for the term overwhelming. Mikio could read all the movements of his opponent, blocking and counterattacking without any openings. But Sachio revealed that Mikio had a set of gear that could read all the movements of his opponent, so essentially, it was the gear that was overwhelming. However, Nanbu observed that it was not just the gear that brought Mikio this far. Suddenly, Mikio made another declaration. Afterwards, Nanbu ran back, excited to tell Joe that luck had found them again. Mikio had issued a challenge to Joe to see who would make it into the top 4 and compete in the official tournament. No matter how they were trapped, once on the ring, he would still have a chance. Although that guy's gear was quite strong, the more he fought, the stronger he became, so he still had a chance. Hearing this, Joe wanted to go train, but Nanbu wouldn't allow it because he thought he wasn't fully able to walk yet. Sachio touched him lightly. He felt pain, and when he took off his shirt, his body was covered in bruises. Nanbu thought he should still rest because if he went into the ring with those bruises, the opponent would target them. Resting is also a way to train. He would be stronger in perfect condition, and his chances of advancing would be higher. Joe became even more determined when he saw Yuri at the match that day. The company's executives then asked Yuki if she was sure about organizing the match between Mikio and Joe. But Mikio had already declared it publicly, so there was no turning back now. Even though Mikio was from the company, he was now a fighter and had his own freedom. After leaving the meeting, Duki was informed by his assistant that Mikio's gear could somewhat compete with Yuri's. If this situation continued, Mikio would only cause more disadvantages for her. It seemed she had no choice but to ask that person to help her defeat Mikio. At that moment, Nanbu met the journalist again, who informed him that the main company did not want Mikio to participate in the tournament. Nanbu should see and find out the reason himself. At this time, Yuki realized that Yuri was becoming more and more perfected with his gear. She then saw her brother Mikio also creating a gear set in preparation for the upcoming match. He knew that Yuki had tried to arrange a match for him with the top 4 to bring him down. She knew he was the biggest obstacle, and if he won, her position as chairwoman would soon be shaken. Even though her grandfather had chosen her, ultimately, it's the company board that has the power. Meanwhile, Joe continued to train under the bridge. Nanbu informed him that every gear has a weakness in the delay when striking. However, Mikio's gear is a machine that controls the person, not the other way around, so the delay is almost non-existent. If he is not careful, he will end up like that top 4 guy. But he wants to, as Mr. Burke said, keep training him to throw a punch so strong that it knocks him down. The reason is that recently, he has been training physically with the kids. He believes that with such a punch, the enemy will be surprised. Nanbu wants Sachio to speak up if he has any ideas in the future, not to silently drag Joe to train without asking him first. Nanbu decided to teach Joe some combination moves so he could make use of the finishing blow he had just learned. He will teach him every move he can think of. Both decided to train until one of them collapses. On the day of the match, Sachio's friends found a way to sneak into the arena. Joe's group was about to enter the field when they encountered Mikio. He had been waiting for them and informed them that they would no longer be able to enter the field because he had discovered the truth about Joe. He is an outlaw and involved in match fixing in the underground arena. He will announce everything in the middle of Joe's ascent to the field. Joe was about to rush forward when Nanbu punched him and dragged him back. Nanbu knew from the start that this match had a predetermined outcome. Joe had not yet appeared on the field, so the clock had started counting down. Mikio swore to reclaim everything that Yuki had stolen from him. And so, the clock struck 0, and Joe still had not entered the field. Nanbu saw that their journey seemed to be ending. On the way back, Joe was very angry, while Nanbu went to meet Fuji to face the consequences. However, Nanbu had not given up entirely. He did not understand why Mikio had obtained information about them. If Mikio wanted to defeat Joe, he could have simply disclosed the information publicly. Instead, he came alone to force them to give up. Tomorrow night would be their last chance to return, and Nanbu had asked Fuji for help to get back into the ring. Fuji then revealed that 2 weeks ago, someone from the underworld had been inquiring about Joe. Fuji and his people had managed to conceal the reasons from Mikio. The information was obtained thanks to some resentful individuals involved in match fixing by both parties. Essentially, Mikio had no evidence to accuse Joe. Fuji had given Nanbu the information he needed. This was also the last opportunity for Nanbu. Fuji also had an important lead for him. Specifically, in the underworld, there was a person who had been a former gear manufacturer for Yuki's company. He was a regular here, so a little persuasion would yield information. That person had been brought to meet Fuji and the process of extracting information from him had begun. Everything about that technology corporation. Meanwhile, Mikio had gone to meet Yuri. He believed that he would definitely enter the main tournament and defeat Yuri after having defeated Roi Hoa Tone. However, Yuri had faith in Joe and warned Mikio to be careful because it wasn't over yet. At that time, a former CIA employee informed them that the corporation was not cohesive and had internal strife because the project Mikio was working on was personally supervised by him instead of being entrusted to the internal team. Sachio heard this and relayed it to Joe. Joe suspected there must be a reason Mikio did not want to fight him. The former employee told Nanbu they couldn't beat Mikio because he had gear that could predict the opponent's movements and block accordingly. But it could only detect movements from the opponent's gear, and since Joe didn't use gear, Mikio was not confident fighting him. Sachio relayed everything he heard to Joe, giving Joe more hope. At this point, Nanbu decided to find someone who could help bring Joe back. That person was Yuki. He wanted a rematch between Joe and Mikio because he was sure luck was Mikio's weakness. But she refused, thinking Joe was just a runaway from the ring. But he believed Mikio had trapped him and Joe, and she was the one who had pulled Joe into this match. She refused to believe him because if he thought Mikio had set a trap for him and Joe, why should she trust him? And she didn't want to place her hopes on someone without gear. Meanwhile, Joe was quite worried because when he faced Mikio, there was no hesitation, and he was still very confident that he could beat Joe. Nanbu had no choice but to show Yuki the real evidence of Joe's dirty past. Whether she chose to believe him was up to her, but the truth was that Joe had defeated strong opponents to get here, and he was a true professional. However, she bluntly locked Nanbu in a room and left. At that moment, Yuki had organized the announcement of the fourth person to enter the official tournament. Nanbu then called Sachio to report his failure. But Sachio informed him that Joe had disappeared. At that time, he was speeding to the ceremony. Yuki had just announced the fourth person to enter the official tournament was Mikio. As he received the paper, Joe drove in to interrupt. Sachio let Nanbu hear, and at that moment, Joe requested a rematch with Mikio. He was unwilling and wanted to protect her, but Yuki decided to trust Joe. She wants Mikio to rematch with Joe because Mikio has to prove his worth through the match, not just because the opponent did not show up for one match. Joe got a second chance and received half a ticket from Yuki. Soon after, the match between the two officially took place. The stands that day were packed, and there were also many watching on the screen. Although Due is Mikio's counter, Joe is still at a disadvantage on the field. Mikio also has martial arts skills, not solely relying on gear. Joe was pushed into a defensive position and could not show much. He was knocked down to the floor, and Nanbu realized that he was gradually being read, even without using gear. Yuki knew this was the new model that Mikio developed to fight Yuri. But now, it had to be used against Joe. Joe tried to use the new techniques he learned to respond. But Mikio's AI learned too quickly and knocked Joe down to the floor again. Joe, angry, rushed in and was swept down. The match has ended, so Joe temporarily has time to think of a strategy. Yuki saw the results were in, but Yuri had not yet sent them. At this time, she still had not found a good way to confront Mikio. The more they fought, the more Joe's moves would be read. But looking behind at Yuki, Mikio knew he would not last long. He was assimilating his brain with artificial intelligence. The longer it went on, the greater the impact on his brain. But Mikio was determined to win to see who truly deserved to inherit the company. Throughout the training process, Mikio had to inject drugs into his body countless times to maintain a stable synchronization. Despite being in the third round, Joe had not improved much. He was still pushed against the ropes and continuously took hits. He kept taunting Mikio, only to be punched out of the ring by him. Nanbu did not allow Sachio to interfere, or else Joe would be disqualified. He wanted Joe to turn around and throw that decisive punch because he believed Joe could still win. Joe returned to the ring to prove that gear does not make a fighter. Earlier, Yuri had met Mikio during his training. Mikio asked why Yuri did not choose AI technology like his but instead chose that disgusting gear. If Yuri believed in Joe, why not settle the score right there to see which gear was better? But Yuri would only fight the winner. After turning back to throw a punch, Mikio raised his hand again. But Yuri wanted to know if this move was Mikio's or someone else's. Indeed, Mikio was nothing without someone else. Turning back, he was continuously hit, but he rushed to embrace Mikio and was thrown off. Both were counted as fouls, so another violation would result in immediate disqualification. Deciding to abandon defense, Joe let Mikio strike, but he suddenly pulled back his punches instead of delivering a finishing blow. The round ended, and Yuri revealed that he wanted to strike, but Mikio resisted. Originally, abandoning defense was to keep Mikio from knowing what Joe was planning. In fact, Joe had almost gambled on that opportunity. Now, Joe had what he wanted, a chance to land a blow and finish the match. At this moment, Mikio hesitated about whether to turn off the automatic system. The support team advised him to do so, but he refused. And then, as the round began, Joe did not assume a defensive stance but stood still. Mikio struck Joe's face, but it was not enough to end the match. Joe asked Nanbu to help him observe, and then both of them realized at the same time that Mikio was about to launch a finishing blow. Nanbu knew it was a straight punch with the left hand, and as Mikio charged forward, he extended his right hand but then struck with his left. Joe anticipated this and dodged slightly, then delivered a straight hook to Mikio's jaw. He was the one who fell, while Joe remained standing. Everyone cheered loudly as someone from the bottom of the rankings rose to become one of the 4 who would participate in the official tournament. Afterward, Mikio turned away and officially acknowledged Joe as a formidable opponent, a true fighter. Despite the somewhat negative things Mikio had done, no one could deny that he was trying his best to assert his value and rise to regain his position in the company. Joe then greeted Yuri with a few words. He has now arrived at his tournament and is ready to rematch. Yuri had to admit it, but still saw him only as a stray dog, albeit not an ordinary one. That evening, Nanbu and the group held a celebration party for Joe's victory. Nanbu, along with a few friends, drank and just wanted to rest. But then, Nanbu suddenly went outside to meet Fuji. He came because there was still a matter to resolve with Nanbu. Nanbu had not yet told Joe and Sachio what really happened, but Fuji said the game was over and now he would have to explain to Joe. In fact, 3 months ago, Fuji had asked him to bring Joe to the main tournament, but they were not allowed to win the match. The reason was that Fuji wanted to arrange a large-scale fixed match, and Nanbu had agreed with Fuji on this. At that moment, he tried to persuade him to follow the fixed match plan. Joe thought he did not trust him, but he knew he was very talented. It's just that people like them, no matter how hard they try, can never match those with power. He really wanted him to participate in the tournament fairly, but they had to use a fake ID to enter, so now there is no turning back. Joe felt that he had lost all trust in Nanbu, so he decided to walk away. Sachio also couldn't believe what Nanbu had done and chose to leave. Meanwhile, Fuji reminded Nanbu that if he didn't fulfill the pact, the price would be paid not only by him but also by the other two. The next morning, the 4 main contestants of the tournament had a press conference, but Joe did not attend. At that time, he was at his uncle's motorcycle repair shop. Previously, his uncle could not have imagined that just 3 months ago, he was still a nobody, but now he is well known. Meanwhile, Nanbu was looking for Sachio. The kid thought that he had exploited Joe, but he knew that the kid was no different from him. He knew that the kid's father had been an engineer for that company, as told by a former employee. He learned that Sachio's father had his research stolen and was eliminated by the company. The kid also admitted that his mother died a year later due to illness, which is why he ended up the way he is now. Afterward, he took Sachio to a party attended by Yuki. He revealed that both he and Sachio shared the same goal of revenge against the company, and both had inadvertently ended up in the same boat because of Joe. Now that Joe had left, the only way he could help Sachio get revenge was by giving the kid a knife and letting him do it himself. The kid had already considered this, but suddenly, seeing children there, he thought better of it. Both had staked their own revenge on Joe by helping him reach the pinnacle. They have chosen to believe in Joe, so now Joe is their hope. But now, if Joe does not throw the match, Fuji will be the force they need to worry about because Fuji has enough power to confront Yuki's entire technology corporation. Nanbu then met with Yuki and asked her to take care of Sachio because, after all, her company also owed the kid. He will not ask too much from her, just that she takes care of Sachio. When Joe's match ends, it will be the last time he meets her in person, and he will also hand over the evidence to Sachio to keep for a few days after the first match of the official tournament has taken place. Yuki also had an internal investigation of the company and found out that indeed, Sachio's father's research had been illegally seized by her company. In this first match, the first fighter to enter the ring is a Mexican fighter. He is a second-ranked fighter known by the nickname Spider PP, and his opponent is the champion of the company that organized this tournament. With the nickname King of Kings, Yuki has now sent her assistant to find and eliminate the illegal trading elements within the company. Joe also came to watch Yuri's match, while Nanbu was somewhere drinking, opening the PB with his style of fighting and long reach, continuously striking. But Yuri remained calm, carefully observing the opponent's actions to respond. Both sides exchanged blows and quickly ended the first and second rounds. PB then took the initiative and rushed at Yuri, forcing him to dodge a dangerous blow and step back a beat. PP had just boasted that he would defeat Yuri, then he immediately charged and threw a hook to PP's chin, followed by another punch to knock Pepe down completely. Everyone failed to see Yuri's blow until they watched it on the slow-motion screen on their way out. Joe met Yuri outside the arena. Joe liked the punch that Yuri had thrown. Iori asked why he didn't use gear. Initially, he didn't use it to stand out, but now he likes the thrill of not using gear. He wants to fight a match with Yuri, a match that will help him truly grow, whether he wins or loses. He asked what Yuri's purpose in fighting was. He fights because he is grateful to Yuki, the person who brought him here. Meanwhile, Nanbu, drunk, arrived at Joe's training place. He just had a small conversation with Fuji. He said that Nanbu is like a scorpion, the kind that injects venom into other creatures. Even if they are riding on the back of a frog to hitch a ride across the river, instinct will make it sting the frog, and then they both drown. Fuji's point is that if Nanbu only acts on instinct, he will soon drag Joe down with him. In the following days, the press continuously reported on Joe's upcoming match. Everyone was betting on Joe's high chances of winning. Fuji called to inform that Nanbu's initial plan seemed to be going very smoothly. Now, he just needed to ensure that Joe would take a dive in the match. Afterward, Nanbu set off, and Fuji's men followed to make sure. Meanwhile, Sachio was helping her with some household chores, not wanting to be seen as a freeloader doing nothing. She asked Sachio if he wanted to come and watch Joe's match, but the boy refused and walked away. That evening, the match between Joe and his opponent took place. Joe's opponent was a fighter known as the Deadly Lion, Glenn, and this match for Joe would be like Vo Tong's battle. It wasn't a bare-handed fight against a tiger, but it was a bare-handed fight against a lion. He was regarded as someone who continuously created miracles without the need for technological support. At that moment, Sachio was feeling a bit fearful and remembered how Joe had taught him to overcome fear by touching something, which would bring him back to reality. Due was still contemplating whether to follow Nanbu's instructions or not. Nanbu was sitting with Fuji, and the bookmakers wanted Nanboy to let Joe fight well in the first 2 rounds and take a dive in the last minute of the 3rd round. Fuji invited Nanbu for a meal to see if he was determined that this would be the last meal of his life. On the other side, Glenn made a flashy entrance by riding on a gold monster truck. As for Joe, it seems he has changed himself. He is now wearing his own gear, which he had discarded and left aside for several months. Everyone was surprised and thought this was Joe's strategy because today, Due had no one to support him. Joe then heard Nanbu's words. Nanbu informed him that the match fixing would occur in the 3rd round, so he should hold on until then. At that time, Sachio arrived at the arena and met his friends, but the boy chose not to enter and ran away on the field. Joe did not seem too disadvantaged, even though Nanbu continuously gave him instructions from above, but he did not follow them and kept fighting in his own way. Indeed, he managed to give Glenn a hard time, exchanging blows and almost landing a hook on Glenn's chin. When Glenn counterattacked, Joe managed to defend himself with his hands and got through the 1st round above where Nanbu was. Fuji's guards advised Nanbu not to try to help Joe win, but he believed Joe had the chance to win, yet he deliberately missed it. Fuji also acknowledged that Joe had the chance to win but intentionally passed it up to avoid being recognized as throwing the match. However, it was clear that Joe was not listening to Nanbu's help and continued into the 2nd round, maintaining his stubborn nature and not heeding Nanbu's words. Because Nanbu was only trying to help him last until the 3rd round, not to help him win. But right after that, Joe began to falter against Glenn, forcing him to listen to Nanbu to stay in the game. Thus, the 2nd round ended. At that time, Sachio was angry with Nanbu and Joe because both were only doing what they wanted. But the boy realized that he was no different when he used Joe for revenge. After that, the boy saw the arena and began to listen to Due about trying to move a little. The boy had practiced a few punches. Round 3 had started, and Nanbu wanted Joe to give up. If he got through this, he would be free. However, Fuji had no intention of letting them be free after this because Joe would always be his money-making machine. Joe was pushed to the corner of the ring, and at that moment, Sachio ran in. The boy told Joe to pull himself together and fight for himself. Yuri, who was in the audience, suddenly left. The bookie's men had to send guards to catch Sachio, but at that moment, Joe took a punch from Glenn and hit the floor. Yuri came down to call Joe to wake up because of the promise he had made to him. Nanbu was the one who gave him the remaining motivation. He wanted Joe to stand up and fight back against the bookie's men up there. He admitted that the boy truly had talent, and it was not just talk. The boy then stood up and returned to the fight. He used his smaller body to dodge Glenn's blows and then landed a punch on him. He continued to exploit openings to hook a punch in front of Glenn. Although that punch missed, it set up for his left punch afterward. This was the move he had learned from Yuri. Sachio, overjoyed, ran up and accidentally dropped Joe's ID. Nanbu was tied up by Fuji, who thought his scorpion had chosen the wrong person to sting. Yuri was now truly envious of Joe and had to admit that he was a genuine fighter. Joe then ran up to find that Nanbu had sacrificed his remaining eye for him. He was the one who wanted to see the boy succeed more than anyone, and now he had sacrificed that chance to help the boy move forward. He did not regret this decision, while Fuji let the two take Nanbu away. That night, Yuri came to find Yuki and told her about his upcoming desire to remove his gear to fight Joe fairly. He wanted to overcome Joe with his own strength, not with this unbalanced tool. Yuki did not want this because she wanted to use Yuri's match to show the world how the gear industry could develop. Yuki rejected Yuri's request. But he did not beg her, he simply informed her that if she did not agree, he would not return here again. The next day, Joe was still training furiously, not just because of what had happened with Nanbu, but also because he was about to fight Yuri. At this time, Nanbu returned, bringing with him Aragaki and his coach. Nanbu wanted to ask Aragaki to be Joe's sparring partner because obviously, he was better than a punching bag. Both had the opportunity to return to the ring. Aragaki's leg was fine, so now he could fight comfortably. Joe also regretted not being able to knock out Aragaki that day, but the coach reminded both that this was just a practice match. Nanbu was very happy because just 3 months ago, they were involved in match fixing in the underworld, and now they were fighting for the world championship. The price to pay was not small, but Nanbu felt he had seen enough. Meanwhile, Yuri had gone to Mikio's house in the forest. He went there to ask Mikio to help him remove his gear so that he could fight Joe. Mikio was not sure this would be successful because the gear had become a part of Yuri's body, and he only had rather primitive tools. At the same time, Yuki kept thinking about Yuri, when suddenly someone called her. She went and met Yuri, who had undergone surgery to remove his gear. Mikio, although he had left the family, thought he should still let Yuki know that Yuri had been a good promoter for the gear she had desired throughout many matches. So now, at least, let Yuri do what he wants. But Yuki still wanted to cancel the final match. She then returned to the company and learned a lot of true information about Joe, that he was just a nobody. So just by releasing this evidence, she could cancel the final match. But was it the right thing to do, and would she ruin Yuki's life because of this? She needed time to think, so she would temporarily keep this evidence. Nanbu remembered when he first met Jay and saw his potential, so he recruited him for training and making money. He then listened and knew that Joe was forgetting his teachings about distributing his strength evenly. He may be blind, but he is not ignorant, so he should not be underestimated. After the training session, Aragaki had to admit that he was very talented and capable of defeating Yuri. Nanbu realized that perhaps Joe had been the one taking care of him all this time. Yuki was torn by pain, continuously banging on the door, forcing Mikio to confine him. Mikio informed Yuki that Yuki had been like this for 5 days, and they could do nothing but pray for Yuki to overcome himself. Mikio actually had a way to help Yuri alleviate the pain, but Yuri refused, wanting to overcome it on his own. If it were Yuki, she could persuade Yuri to take medicine to temporarily relieve the pain and rest. She met with Yuri and wanted to bring Hyori back, but he said his teacher had taught him to keep an eye on the person he was willing to fight for his whole life. Now that he had found that person, he did not want Yuki to take away his reason for living. The next morning, Yuki checked on Yuri again. He had overcome the pain and resumed training. She recognized in Yuri the same figure she had seen the first time she met him on the training ground. Yuki then decided to leave and end things with Yuri so he could do what he wanted. She then came to me to return him this fake identification card. She really knew who he was but still turned a blind eye. She also mentioned that Yuri had removed his gear to be able to fight him. Although it was shocking, he was also very excited that his opponent was so determined. Therefore, he also tried to persistently train non-stop to respond to Yuki in the best physical condition. And then, not long after, the day of the decisive match finally arrived. On the day the match was about to take place, Joe was sent back the amulet ticket that Aragaki had previously entrusted to Nanbu. And on the day of the match, everyone was surprised to see 2 fighters on the field not using gear. At the same time, Sachio noticed scars on the parts of Yuri's body where the gear had been attached. Indeed, Yuri was the perfect opponent for Joe. At this time, Yuki was still upset with Yuri and did not come to watch the final match. Joe, now on the field, was gradually being overpowered by Yuri. The loss of gear did not slow Yuri down but instead gave him the best physical condition. Until now, all of Joe's moves had been seen through by Yuri. After a while of fighting, the first round ended. Joe had to admit that he was being dominated by Yuri. So now he had to get serious. Nanbu said that although Yuri was good at both defense and attack, he was still human and would eventually show weakness. Yuri, during the break, did not sit down to rest at all. Everyone thought he was full of energy, but Mikio knew that Yuri was currently suppressing the pain from the surgery. If he sits down now, he will not be able to stand up again. Returning to the second round, Joe continued to defend. But in a moment, he surged up and hooked a punch, forcing Yuri to dodge. He intended to counterattack, but Joe rolled away and struck back. Noticing Yuri was about to counter, Joe immediately returned to a defensive stance. He then found an opportunity to strike, but Yuri dodged instantly and countered with a direct punch. Joe continued to stand up, but the round had ended. Nanbu knew this would be a match of endurance. Whoever made a mistake or exhausted first would lose. In the following rounds, Joe kept defending, waiting for Yuri to make a mistake. But Yuri was alert, intentionally showing weaknesses to lure Joe into attacking, to counter. Joe had to watch Yuri's legs to find an opening, but Yuri's chance of making a mistake was very low. He threw feints, Joe moved to the side, and Yuri landed a punch to his side. But as he intended to hook, Joe dodged and counterattacked. Both showed no signs of fatigue, and the advantage was still undecided. Meanwhile, Yuki met with the military to introduce her product, but they wanted her to integrate weapons into the gear. She refused because she created tools to assist, not weapons. However, they argued that she had turned it into a weapon by allowing fighters to use it in the tournament. The enduring match between Yuri and Joe had now reached the 7th round. Sachio saw Yuri fighting alone without support and brought him a glass of water. They all respected an opponent like him and did not want him to lose just because of a lack of water. He reluctantly accepted and continued the match. The two prolonged the fight until the 10th round, but the intensity did not decrease throughout the 11th round. Joe began to visibly tire, but Nanbu reminded him of who he is. He is the strongest fighter in the tournament, and Yuri, even as the champion, is still nothing compared to him. He then regained his spirit to continue defending against Yuri's fierce attacks until the start of the 13th round. Joe decided not to defend anymore. He continuously exchanged blows with Yuri. The ring was more ablaze than ever, and Yuri felt fortunate to have met Joe. But then, he decided to finish the match with Joe after a single blow. Both charged and delivered their strongest punches. He had an impact on his opponent, Yuri. After hearing the match's result, he hurried back, and then we saw that one of the two fighters had to be hospitalized. Not long after, Nanbu decided to reopen the yoga studio. He was sitting and rolling when Sachio invited him to a party. A few days ago, Chukai came to congratulate me but then left quite quickly. Yuri realized that a year had passed. At this time, he had learned to repair vehicles from that uncle and was working as a delivery man. Yuki is planning to reopen the tournament once more, and the repairman uncle asked Joe if he intends to return as a fighter. He does not know if he should return, but for now, it is enough for him. On his way, Joe stopped to admire the sea and began to dance a few boxing moves. And with this, the film also comes to an end.